Za Radio Slobodna Evropa govori američki ambasador u Bosni i Hercegovini gospodin Michael Murphy. Želim vam dobrodošlicu i hvala na ovom intervju. Na početku da vas pitam kako međunarodni zvaničnici u Bosni i Hercegovini su zabrinuti zbog trenutne političke situacije. Dijelite li vi tu zabrinutost?
Yes, we do. I think it's not a secret. I think it's readily apparent that Bosnia and Herzegovina is not moving in the right direction and hasn't been for some time. There isn't a day that goes by when there isn't some sort of terrible rhetoric coming from the political leaders here, threats of secession, threats to reorganize the territory of the country, or just plain warmongering. And that's a horrible and irresponsible way to lead your country. The other problem is that we're not seeing progress on reforms. There's been almost no progress on any of the EU-related reforms, for example. And there's no work being done right now on some of the problems that face the country, like inflation or the potential for an energy shortage in the future. And all of those things are being ignored. And that's not good for Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's not good for the people of this country or the citizens here.
Evo, pomenuli ste građane Bosne i Hercegovine koji vrlo često odlaze na zapad, prvenstveno zbog sigurnosti. Kako vi ocjenjujete sigurnosnu situaciju u BiH?
Well, let me start by talking a bit about the fact that people are voting with their feet and deciding to leave the country. The estimates are from 50 to 55,000 people are leaving every year. Some of them leave for economic reasons, and of course some of them leave for political reasons. And I can understand why someone who wants to build a better future for themselves and their family and their children, their grandchildren, would want to leave BiH. It's a human impulse to want to make a better life for yourself and your family. My ancestors left the United States more than 100 years ago for just those reasons. But the problem now is more serious, in part because of the political and the security deterioration here. And the blame for that problem falls squarely on the shoulders of the political leaders, who have put their own narrow ethno-nationalist and corrupt interests above those needs of the people and the citizens and the people who are voting for them. They've made a series of promises that they've failed to deliver on. Now, I do have some optimistic notes in all of this, which is, first, I've traveled around this country before during my tenure here from 2006 to 2009, and quite a bit since I arrived. And no matter where I go, whether it's Mostar or Banja Luka or here in Sarajevo, I am consistently impressed with the people of this country, where they want to take the country, their resilience, their spirit. And I see it with the youth leaders that we're sending to the United States in some of our programs. I see it with some of the young entrepreneurs and investors. I see it with the investigative journalists and the activists who are combating corruption. That's a good thing, and that's a positive thing. And I think it's worth remembering that, because that's where the strength of this country lies. The other is that you have a friend in the United States of America. We care about Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we have for 25, 30 years, and that hasn't changed. And we want to ensure that we protect this country's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and multi-ethnic character. And we're prepared to use the tools at our disposal to defend this country's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and multi-ethnic character. That includes sanctions where appropriate. And as Tony Blinken said in his testimony a few months back, we're committed to staying. We're not leaving Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Pomenuli ste također i korupciju, što je zaista gorući problem u Bosni i Hercegovini. Prvenstveno mislim na političku korupciju. Sjedinjene Američke Države su se ovdje u kantonu Sarajevo prilično uključile u borbu protiv korupcije. Ali kako je iskorijeniti? Bosna i Hercegovina je prema indeksu korupcije na začelju u regiji.
Corruption is definitely a big and serious problem in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And people often ask me, what's changed from 13 years ago when you were here before? And one of those changes, unfortunately, is that corruption is much, much worse. And you're right, it is an extremely difficult problem to root out, and it's an extremely difficult problem to defeat. Now, we're going to do what we can, in part by supporting anti-corruption offices, by supporting changes to legislation, by standing by prosecutors and police officers and investigative journalists who have the courage and have the commitment to root out these problems. But it's a long, hard fight. It's not going to happen in a day. It's not going to happen in a month. It's not even going to happen in a year. But one thing we're going to do, and one of the signals we're trying to send to the political leaders here, is that we're going to be persistent. We're not going to let up. I've been quite clear about that in my meetings with the political leaders. This is important to the United States. It's why we've used our sanctions tools on corruption. It's why we're funding the anti-corruption offices. We're not going to stop. We'll have setbacks, but we're not going to stop. Persistence is an important part of this.
Neki od političkih lidera su na crnoj američkoj listi upravo zbog korupcije, ali čini se kao da oni ne mare za to. Neki od njih su ponovo sad evo na izbornim listama za ovogodišnje izbore. Jel mi vi mislite da možda bi pravosudne institucije mogle bolje reagovati u Bosni i Hercegovini?
Well, let me start first with the front end of your question about the political leaders. Yes, some of the leaders are on blacklists. And yes, some of those leaders are running for office. They shouldn't be. But the voters have an opportunity to pass judgment on their performance this October. And if they're happy with their performance, then they vote accordingly. If they're unhappy with their performance, they vote accordingly. One of the beauties of a democracy is that the citizens of the country have a say. They have an opportunity every 4 years or every 2 years, depending on the election cycle, to say, you know what? I want to see something different. I'm not happy with what I'm getting from my political leaders. So that's really important. Second, your question about the judiciary. Yes, they can be doing better, much better. I was at an event a few weeks ago that was sponsored by the Damir Naut and his work that they have done jointly to take a look at judicial institutions and where they're performing well and where they're failing. And that's an impressive piece of work and a positive piece of work for Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it says to me that there are some politicians who do care, and there are some politicians who want to hold the judiciary and the prosecutors and the law enforcement officers accountable for their work. And that kind of work has to continue. And what the United States is going to do is support that kind of work, both politically in terms of standing next to people who are trying to do the right thing, but also, as I mentioned earlier, with some of our assistance programs and our work with the judges and the prosecutors. And we will hold judges and prosecutors accountable as well.
Pored Sjedinjenih Američkih Država, aktivno se uključuje novi visoki predstavnik u Bosni i Hercegovini, gospodin Schmidt. Već nekoliko puta je primijenio bonska ovlaštenja. Govori se sad vrlo često i o izbornoj reformi. Prema vašoj ocjeni, kakva ona treba da bude, a da bude po mjeri svih?
Well, let me start by talking about our policy towards the High Representative's office and the use of the bond powers, because it's been consistent for over 25 years. We support, the United States supports, a strong office of the High Representative and the use of the bond powers where appropriate. That's not new, it's bipartisan. It's been the policy enunciated by every ambassador who came before me, and it's the policy I've enunciated to you just now. So that's the first point I'd like to make. Second point I'd like to make is this High Rep has used the bond powers already a couple times. And he's used it because the politicians here have failed to act to address the problems that confront the country. Election financing, for example. But it's not the only place where the politicians have failed to act. Politicians have taken an all-or-nothing approach to engaging on these issue sets. They've concluded that compromise is a dirty word or a sign of weakness as opposed to success. And of course, the exact opposite is true. In a democracy, compromise is how things get done. And if the politicians of this country, the leaders, continue to take the approach that we saw, for example, in March earlier this year, where it has to be everything I want and nothing the other guy wants, or they won't participate in negotiations at all, then there's not going to be progress on problem sets. And it's going to be up to the High Representative to make a decision about when and where he needs to act to safeguard the Dayton Peace Agreement and the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and security, multi-ethnic character of BiH. Now, about solutions. I go back to the idea of compromise in a democracy. There isn't a solution that will satisfy everybody. That's not how it works in a democracy. But what everyone needs to understand is that you can get some wins in a negotiation, but in order to get some of those wins, you have to make some concessions to the person with whom you're negotiating. And without that, what you get is everybody is unhappy, where no one can walk out of the room and say, this is important to us, we accomplished this. We agreed because of comedy, democracy, building a better future for the citizens of this country matters, we agreed to make this concession here. That's not where the political leaders are, and that's unfortunate. And again, I think there's an opportunity in the elections that are coming up in October for the citizens, the voters of this country, to decide whether that's what they want or not.
Kad smo kod dogovaranja političara, oni vrlo često znaju ovdje u Bosni i Hercegovini da se recimo dogovore oko nečega, onda poslije izvjesnog vremena kažu nismo se dogovorili. Takva je situacija kad je u pitanju o procesu približavanja Bosne i Hercegovine NATO-u. Program reformi je usvojen, međutim, evo pomaka nema u posljednjih godinu dana i posebno se sve aktualiziralo ruskom invazijom na Ukrajinu, gdje Republika Srpska tvrdi uz pomoć naravno Rusije kako Bosna i Hercegovina neće ići u NATO. Kako vi ocjenjujete uopšte ulogu Rusije u čitavom ovom procesu?
Well, let me start with the comment you alluded to that the Russians have made. Russia doesn't have a say in the decisions that Bosnia and Herzegovina make about its treaty relationships, whether that's joining the European Union or joining NATO. Those decisions are for a sovereign BiH to make. That's number one. Number two, it's quite clear that the citizens of this country and the politicians of this country have set as a goal advancing towards and joining these Euro-Atlantic institutions. We support those goals. That's what the people support. So, I would take a look at what Russia is doing here in this country, and I would suggest that they're working against those goals. They're working against those objectives that the citizens of this country want. And some of their statements have frankly been irresponsible. I don't think if you take a look at what Russia is doing in Europe right now, the brutal and barbaric aggression in Ukraine, you can conclude that Russia has the interests not only not of Europe, but Bosnia and the whole Western Balkans at its heart. It's not interested in seeing stability, security, peace, prosperity, a prosperous BiH. That's the problem.
Ipak ne može se osporiti njihov uticaj na Republiku Srpsku. Gotovo su svakodnevni razgovori ruskog ambasadora u Bosni i Hercegovini sa gospodinom Dodikom. Koliko je to u ovom trenutku opasno za Bosnu i Hercegovinu?
Well, first, obviously the Russian ambassador is a diplomat just like me. And as I think I said in my opening press conference when I first arrived, he can speak to political leaders in this country just like my colleagues and I speak to political leaders in this country. So I don't think a conversation in and of itself is a threat. Second, they've made some terrible, irresponsible statements about BiH, but I would suggest that the United States, the European Union, NATO have been quite clear about their commitment to the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and multi-ethnic character of this country. And I said earlier in our conversation that's part of the good news story, and I know sometimes it's hard to find a good news story in BiH, is that commitment of the United States is enduring. I want to go back to what Secretary Blinken said in his congressional testimony. We're not leaving, right? We're not going to go away. We're going to sustain our international presence here and our international military presence. And I think that's really important when making an assessment about the security of the situation here. When EUFOR perceived some challenges and problems, it increased its presence here. That was the right thing to do, and we supported it. So I think you did see from the United States and from the Europeans a response, and it should signal that we're not going to leave BiH to Russia. That is not going to be the outcome here.
Kako ocjenjujete politiku bosansko-hercegovačkih susjeda Hrvatske i Srbije prema ovdašnjim zbivanjima?
Look, we welcome constructive engagement in the Western Balkans among neighbors. And I want to emphasize the word here is constructive. I think the focus of the countries of the region, all the countries of the region, needs to be on improving good neighborly relations and working through differences. And there are differences between nation states. It's true all over the world. We have differences with Canada, for example. But there's a way you work through those differences. You work through them collaboratively, cooperatively, with the goal of finding a solution that benefits both. We need to see more of that.
Više puta ste pomenuli tokom ovog intervjua da su Sjedinjene Američke Države na strani Bosne i Hercegovine, na strani njenih građana, ali i da je na građanima u oktobru da kažu šta misle o trenutno o situaciji u Bosni i Hercegovini. Pomenuli ste da imate i mehanizme i da ćete ih koristiti. Možete li nam možda malo pobliže govoriti kakva uloga će biti i dalje Sjedinjenih Američkih Država u Bosni i Hercegovini?
Well, let me start with the 100,000-foot answer to your question. Now I'm going to go back and repeat something I said earlier. Our commitment to Bosnia and Herzegovina is enduring, to its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and its multi-ethnic character. We have been a friend for 25 years. We're going to continue to be a friend and a supporter of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that includes with the kind of investments I mentioned earlier in combating corruption, the work we're doing to help develop tourism here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the work we're doing with the youth of this country, the efforts we're making to attract investment here, through the diaspora, for example. All of that is going to continue. I'm not going to speculate about which tools, and I think you're probably referring to sanctions here, that we're going to use and when we're going to use them. But rest assured, and I think it's clear from the last 7 months, when we believe it is appropriate and necessary, we will use those tools.
Hvala vam na razgovoru za Radio Slobodna Evropa.
It's my pleasure.
Za Radio Slobodna Evropa govorio je američki ambasador u Bosni i Hercegovini, gospodin Michael Murphy.